Welcome back. President Biden issued his first veto today, preserving a rule that allows retirement companies to emphasize climate and social initiatives. This comes as his approval reaches the highest point so far of his presidency. In fact, there's one Rasmussen poll putting it at 46%. Our pal Democratic strategist Kevin Walling here in studio tonight, live with us on the Final Five. Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Yeah, but first of all, are you still tasting the ranch ice cream from Like It or Not tonight?
It's still in my system. It's still backing up on me. It was a great show, but ooh.
Kevin joined us on Like It or Not earlier this evening, and we made him try ranch ice cream. That's not why you're here. So, yeah, this was the first time Joe Biden issues a veto. Obviously, his purview as president, but he vetoed something that was passed by a Republican House and a Democratic Senate when it comes to these investment, these guidelines for investment companies. What kind of message is the president sending here?
I think the president is sending a message that he is fired up to run for re-election, that he's going to take the fight to the American people. This veto he's been talking about, right, removing the government in terms of decision-making with investing, especially with retirement funds and things like that. Only a few Democrats joined Republicans in the Senate to pass it. Obviously, you have a Republican House that passed it. That's all that you need. But, of course, the president thought differently, just like he thought differently on the D.C. crime bill and things like that.
Which obviously was signed as well. I want to ask you, though, because you talked about when he runs for re-election, why hasn't he announced it yet? If there's been this wondering when he's going to make the decision. It seems like he's going to run. I don't expect there to be a surprise. I'm sure you don't either. So why hasn't he announced yet?
I think it's a great question. I think when you're president, you want to delay this decision being public as long as possible. You want to be president for as long as possible before you're a candidate, right? So last week, the president was with, the Australian Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, unveiling this new sub-deal. That's the presidency, front and center, national security, international relations, and not to get bogged down in the campaign, right? Donald Trump had his first re-election campaign event in May of this year, right, that we're coming up on. Obviously, presidents have announced in April and in May. That's the timeline I think you'll see the president do it.
So you don't think he's going to be spurred by the Marianne Williamson announcement or anything like that? But
hey, now he's got pressure behind him, with her crystals.
As you watch all of that play out, we mentioned the polls, and I took a look at the latest numbers out there. 46% for President Biden, which, clearly is not through the roof, but it's certainly an increase of where he saw it from the low water mark. When you look at other presidents, when they're at this point in their presidency, it usually is around that mark, too.
It is. And I think he's in a good shape to run for re-election, right? You had unified Democratic control the first 2 years of his presidency. We passed a lot of monumental pieces of legislation on guns, on the environment, on education, on infrastructure. These are all things that the president can campaign on in these next 18 months.
As you watch what's going on the other side right now, and we know that the former president is running, regardless of what happens in Manhattan this week. Ron DeSantis hasn't announced yet, but he certainly sounds like he's running. There is some serious discord on the right, and it seems as though, in spite of the fact that you have polls that say maybe Democrats would like to see somebody else run along the way, there are some numbers that suggest that it is a wide open field, all things considered, for President Biden.
It's a good point, and I think that really came out of the midterm elections, right, where he defied expectations as an incumbent president in their first midterm election. We only lost 5 seats in the House. We gained a seat in the Senate, defying all historical pronouncements in the past. And I think that then sent a message to members of Congress, anyone that was thinking about potentially running, that this guy is serious, has the mojo, and can do it.
What do you make, obviously not here for legal perspective from you, but when you look at it from a political perspective with this potential indictment of President Trump, there have been people who have said, well, it's a Soros-backed prosecutor, which seems to be a popular word among many on the right. There are people saying this is political persecution by the FBI. And there are some people who are forecasting, well, if President Trump is indicted, that he will coast a re-election here. When you see that, what's your take?
I'm of two minds, right? I think it'll be a boon to his base, right? He'll be able to fundraise off this and things like that. I think anytime you have a president, a former president, with a mugshot, though, and Chris Christie made this point this past weekend, that's not a good thing to have in an indicted elected official running again for office. So I'm of two minds. I think it'll fire up his base. But at the end of the day, I think for independent voters, moderate voters, seeing a president with a mugshot is not a good message.
As we look ahead towards the rest of the year, because you mentioned President Biden has work to do as president, when you look at Congress, well, what could come down the pipeline? What are you paying attention to from a political perspective apart from 2024 right now?
Well, it's certainly the case in the Republican House that they're all about investigations and oversight, right? And putting a lot of stock in those kind of operations. We've got some serious things that we need to do just as a country, right? Debt limit, budget negotiations. We're still waiting on the Republican budget that is delayed. I'd like to see where they're at, right? The president put out his budget more than a few weeks ago, right? Talking about protecting Social Security, Medicare. I think there's going to be debates over entitlements, and I think that's what you're going to see in the next couple of months.
Well, and that's one thing, a point I believe the last time you were on, which I thought the president was quite smart in doing with the State of the Union, was getting everybody almost not on the record, so to speak, but pretty much close to it on camera, saying
it's going to really be really tough to go back on what they promised on the floor of the House.
What happens there. Kevin Wallen, good to see you, my friend. Thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks.
And the Final Five is back after this.